Thanks for coming, everybody. We're really excited to have this event with Derf. If you buy Derf's book, Kent State, 4 Dead in Ohio, he was so kind as to sign some book plates for us. So if you buy this book from us, you can do it either from our website or in the store. You get a free signed book plate. We also have some of Derf's other books too. Those are on our website too. All right, so just a real quick intro about Derf's book. All right. On May 4th, 1970, the Ohio National Guard gunned down unarmed college students protesting the Vietnam War at Kent State University. In a deadly barrage of 67 shots, 4 students were killed and 9 wounded. It was the day America turned guns on its own children. Using the journalism skills he employed on his celebrated graphic novels, My Friend Dahmer and Trashed, Derf has conducted extensive interviews and research to explore how mistakes, political rancor, and paranoia built to a deadly crescendo on an American campus. Kent State, 4 Dead in Ohio is published on the 50th anniversary of the tragedy and is a moving, what's that?
It wasn't. It wasn't.
Well, it was. So now post 50th anniversary is a moving and troubling story about the bitter price of dissent as relevant today as it was in 1970. Derf is the recipient of a prestigious Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for political cartooning, and his weekly comic strip, The City, appeared in more than 100 newspapers for almost 25 years. He lives in Cleveland, Ohio, and is visiting us from his studio. So I'm going to post a bunch of stuff in the links. You post your questions, and we will hand this over to Derf. Yay! I'm going to mute myself.
All right. Is it me? I'm up. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Trivia point, while we were playing Devo in the waiting room, is that Devo began at Kent State on May 4, 1970 with the shootings. All those guys were on campus that day. And a couple of them were in the line of fire. And they were so disturbed by what happened afterwards, they formed a band, which originally was like an art punk outfit that did performance and shit, and began this whole concept of de-evolution, and society was, devolving, which was pretty much spot on. But that goes directly to the Kent State shootings, which is kind of amazing. So one of the spawning grounds of punk rock was actually the Kent State Massacre, which is, yeah. Anyways, I'm going to share my screen and start yammering. So just give me a sec. Pow, pow, pow. Okay, here we go. Everybody see me? I'll take that as a yes. I see heads nodding. So this book was 4 years in the making. It's really nice talking to a comics crowd because so far it's been mostly book crowds, and I have to do the whole like defense of comics spiel and, bam, pow, comics just aren't for kids anymore, that kind of crap. So it's great to be talking to people who already know what I'm talking about. So this is actually going to be a little more about process and about the storytelling decisions I made in putting this book together. The story opens, and my connection to it opens in my hometown. I grew up in a small town near Kent. And the Ohio National Guard occupied my hometown the week before the shootings. This was April 1970. I was 10 years old. And they came in to stamp out a trucker strike that had gotten kind of out of hand. And this had a profound impact on me. And then later, when the same unit, members of the 145th Ohio, some of these guys actually opened fire on Blanket Hill a couple days later. So it's a story I've always carried around with me. For that, it's really indelibly implanted in the DNA of people that live around Kent and in Northeast Ohio, Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown. It's just part of our, everybody knows about it. If you were born from like a 30-year period, you know all about it, or anyways about Kent State immediately. And it's just something that's part of the local history, more as much as it is a national event. So like I said, I was 10 years old, and this man, seeing these soldiers in my hometown, it was like, the Army invades Mayberry. And it really rattled me. And for the first time, I started thinking more about the world around me. I mean, in that kid way, up until that point, I was just kind of clueless. I mean, a lot of stuff was happening in the world. In 1970 was the climax of, a pretty horrible era in American politics, much like 220 is apparently. And 1970 specifically was one of the worst years we've ever had. But, to me, it was, from my way of thinking, it was just the norm. I mean, the Vietnam War was going on, and that was horrible. But there'd always been a Vietnam War, as far as I was concerned. And people were filling the streets, protesters. There was police crackdowns everywhere. But those things had always happened. It was kind of this weird kid way of thinking. So the events of May 1970 really shook me up and rattled that a little bit. And I started developing a little intellectual curiosity and looking around at the world for the first time. And that probably would have happened anyways, because it does for everybody. But this is what did it. So this is one of the reasons this story has always been near and dear to my heart, other than also that it's just such an incredible story. And I don't think a lot of people really understand the complexities of the story. Most people who think about Kent State think, well, there was a protest, something happened, and some people got shot. And it was a horrible, tragic accident. That is not the story. So, it was with that attitude that I came into this and thought I can do something with it. This is the view from my elementary school. This is the National Guard, which camped directly next to my elementary school. And that's my soccer field those tents are pitched on. And, the Teamsters who were on strike, they were boogeymen to the Republican governor who sent in the Guard. But these were my neighbors. These were the fathers of my classmates. These were my Little League coaches, So it was really disturbing to see soldiers facing off against them the way they did. So much so that this is a political cartoon I drew at age 10. This might be one of my first political cartoons. And I drew it about the Guard. So, that kind of set me on this path. And my first incarnation in comics was actually as a political cartoonist. I did it in college, and then for like 5 years as a pro before I had enough and jumped out the window. But it's a straight line for me from Kent State to my first, development as a cartoonist. Now, a little bit about 1970. Of course, the Vietnam War had been going on for a long time at that point. 1969 was one of the deadliest years in the war. 11,000 dead. And think about this. The entire casualties of the Vietnam War have now been quadrupled in 6 months, thanks to COVID in this country. Pretty staggering. Millions filled the streets protesting the war as public opinion turned against it. Police cracked down all over the country, mainly on campuses, but also in the streets. Any of this sounding vaguely familiar? Cities were in flames. Police were exceeding their bounds. We had an authoritarian president who was trashing the Constitution and cracking down on his enemies. Again, what we've done here is I've watched this summer unfold in horror. As Liz said, the book was supposed to be out in the spring, and I thought it was going to be relevant, leading up to that. But the events of the summer have it's just made my blood run cold. It's like we have circled back completely around to 1970. And we know how 1970 climaxed, so this is not a good thing. We don't need to talk about that. And anyways, 1970, over it all hung the specter of the Cold War and the seemingly invincible Soviet Union and nuclear annihilation just a moment away. In Ohio, the governor, James A. Rhodes, kept order at the point of a gun. Rhodes, who was a down-home glad-hander, was also an authoritarian strongman who sent out the National Guard to crush civil and labor unrest more than any other governor in the country. Texas at number 2 wasn't even close. Ohio was also one of the few states that mandated that its guardsmen carry live ammo into civil unrest. So right from the beginning, the stage was set for tragedy. Rhodes was a staunch Nixon ally. He fancied himself, much like Nixon, as cracking down, particularly on the anti-war movement, which was also a favorite target of Nixon. And between the two of them, they wanted to crush the anti-war movement and make it irrelevant. So that's setting the stage, because you have to have context, to understand what's about to happen. But this story is it's not a history lesson. So at the beginning, when I sat down and thought, all right, I'm going to tell this story, I made the decision to do this book. But then you have to figure out, okay, how am I going to do it? And the decision I made from the beginning was to tell this story through the eyes of the four who were cut down on May 4, 1970. 4 college kids, remarkable kids, period, but also very typical in so many ways. They were just, the oldest was 20, the youngest was 19. She had just turned 19. And they were like so many college kids before, like everyone here, like me. You're in college, you're trying to figure out your place in the world, find your way, fall in love, screw up, make mistakes, have fun. And they were mowed down. They were swept up in these events of history. And the thing about Kent State is that it was the climax of this entire era that I just talked about, where all of these great forces that were roiling the nation and tearing it apart, as much as things are happening now, maybe even more so, they all came crashing together inexplicably on this one day at Kent State University in Ohio. And these 4 were swept away by those events. So I thought by really focusing on them and telling the story through their eyes and through their experiences, I'm actually putting the reader on the ground with them. And you walk with them and you learn about them. You learn about their hopes, their fears, their dreams, how they interact with each other, how they move through the world. And so when they're cut down, I wanted it to be felt. I wanted this history to be felt in the way that the people that I talked to, the students of 1970, felt this history and still feel this history. I wanted that emotional impact. And you find emotion, by making it about people. So they're just kind of remarkable, very typical kids. Bill Schroeder was a ROTC cadet, really about a perfect kid. He wanted to be an Army psychologist, helped combat veterans. He was an honor student. He was hardworking. He wrote letters to his mom every week. His friends loved him. He had the mind of a scientist and the heart of a philosopher. And Sandy Scheuer, who was bubbly and fun and loving, she was a speech therapy major, so she was working with disabled kids. A friend of hers described her as wanting to save all the puppies in the world. And Jeff Miller, who was a transplant from Long Island, was this gregarious, fun, creative kid who really wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he was having a blast figuring it out. And Allison Krauss, who was the youngest of the 4, was creative and loving and serious and already a committed peace activist. And so I talked to all their friends. I got as close to as many people as I could who knew them. Not so much family. I really wanted to talk to people who, spent time with them at Kent. I was able to read some of their personal correspondence. I saw a lot of their artifacts. For example, these are Allison Krauss's art supplies. She was an art major. And I actually get to hold these in my hand, and that's a really moving thing, especially for a fellow artist, because, these implements are so much a part of you when you're an artist. And I used tools like these when I was in college. I used some of those exact pen points. And just to hold them, it just felt like I was holding a piece of Allison. I mean, it was a very moving thing. So those are the lengths I went to try to learn who these people were 50 years in the rearview mirror. The story itself, the way I set up the structure, I have those 4 threads. I actually have a 5th thread because I added that of a guardsman I found his account in an archive, and it's a great account. And he's present through every event that happens. And he was one of the shooters. He's the only one who's ever talked, even though he's only talked anonymously. But I included him as well. It's a dramatic recreation, and I'm upfront with that at the beginning of the book. But that's the only way I could really do it. So I have those 5 threads that wind through the story. But I really wanted the structure to be tight because I wanted this page-turning narrative. So I decided just to focus in on these 4 days in May when trouble first flared up, right up until the shootings. So I was really just narrowing that focus down. I mean, I include some context throughout the book, but it's really those 4 days. It starts the night before. See, I lied. It's 4.5 days. It started the night before on April 30th when Nixon went on the air and announced, stunned the nation, that U.S. forces were invading neutral Cambodia. Nixon had promised to end the war. He just had a speech where he said the U.S. was starting to pull out, and now here he is invading another country. The next day, college campuses around the country exploded in outrage. Because remember, Vietnam was not a war fought by volunteers, as every war has been since. Half of the combat forces in Vietnam were drafted, conscripted. And draft-age men in this country, and it was all men at that point, lived in constant fear of getting that notice in the mail, and 2 or 3 months later, suddenly they're walking through the jungle wondering if they're going to see the next day. It was the bane of that generation, and it was the fuse that lit the entire anti-war movement. But at Kent State, it also kind of started very quietly. I'm not going to really go through all the details that happened here, but I want to talk a little bit about how I made these decisions. A lot of splash pages in Kent State. They're all in all my books. I love splash pages and double page spreads. It's kind of like an homage to Jack Kirby more than anything. But I just love them, and I think they're really great for making statements. So I start off each chapter with a splash page, and I'll have a couple more. That night, trouble flares up at a downtown bar strip called Water Street, where some anti-war activists, anger mixed with beer, and the kids kind of go on a window smashing spree. And the local mayor, this small town rube, freaks out and calls Rhodes, governor, begging for help because he's afraid that all 21,000 students on the Kent State campus are going to rise up as one and come pouring over the hill and burn his town to the ground. He actually believed that. Kent State is this incredible mix of political grandstanding, incompetence, and malevolence. And I'll talk about that as we go along. This is an example of both political grandstanding and incompetence here. Incompetence on the mayor's part. The governor was running for an open U.S. Senate seat. He was about to be term limited out. The primary was Tuesday, May 5th, 1970. He was trailing his opponent, and he was looking for a way to make up ground. So he sent in the Guard against Teamsters to break up Teamsters strike as a way of pandering to his Republican base. Now, here was this golden opportunity that dropped into his lap. Unruly student radicals, the #1 boogeyman of the era, right up there with Antifa and BLM today. This is what the Fox News set, before Fox News, of course, this is what they obsessed about. And so here was Rhodes's opportunity, and so in came the Guard. It was all about him winning an election, in other words, as hard as that is to believe, and 4 people lost their lives. The next day, the interesting structure about this story is that, as I said, it started quietly. Every day starts quietly. There's 4 days, 4 chapters. Every day starts very quietly, then tensions build. And then there's some big explosive event, and tensions release. And the next day we start again. It's like this up and down effect for the narrative, which is, I've never really told a story that way. I mean, that's the story that was handed to me, obviously. But it's kind of a very unusual story structure. And a lot of this stuff happens, you have this big explosive event, and there's very normal stuff happening around campus otherwise. It's a big campus, 21,000 students. and only a couple hundred are actually causing trouble. It's akin to, getting reports out of Portland where, yeah, there's this big clash with cops on the main street, and 2 blocks away, there's a row of food trucks set up. I mean, it's that kind of contrast, very similar, where you have something really abnormal and just a few blocks away, something very normal. But I really love these quiet moments, and the book is full of them because this is where you find the humanity of the story. Now, this is Sandy. On Saturday, after the Water Street riot, she gets a visit from her mom, who's bringing her some warm weather clothes that she wanted. Her mom lived nearby. She lived like maybe 50 miles away. Now think about what we're seeing here, though. I mean, this is the last time that Sandy's mom hugs her daughter. It's the last time she smells her hair and hears her voice. I mean, imagine what this poor woman went through. I mean, just think about the emotion of that tragedy, and how it affected these people. I mean, it's just overwhelming. And, I kind of get choked up just thinking about, I mean, imagine if it was if you have a daughter, imagine I have a daughter who is Sandy's age right now. I mean, it's really, those scenes were very important to me. That evening, there's another big flare up. A bunch of students attack the ROTC building, which 1970 ROTC buildings and campuses were frequent targets. A number of them were torched, attacked, and at Kent State, it was really spectacular because theirs went up in a fireball. It turns out that the ROTC building, which was this old wooden Army field hospital from World War II, was full of ammo. It had 2,000 rounds of ammo in it. So someone threw an oily rag on fire in the window, and it hit one of those boxes of ammo, and kaboom. And right at that minute, the National Guard marches onto campus. And this book has a lot of the action takes place at night. So there's some really dramatic drawing here, which was kind of fun. I draw a pretty badass night scene, if I say so myself. Give myself a pat on the back. But they're a lot of fun to draw, and especially on Saturday night, you've got these really dramatic lighting with the fire and everything like this. And these accounts all come from eyewitnesses, people I interviewed, the students of 1970 who were there. And they gave me some really incredible stories, and it was a chance to tell this story visually, which really hasn't been done before. And this is what I think that comics can bring to this history very effectively, maybe more effectively than anything else. There's been a lot of books written about May 4. Of course, we have those, iconic photos from the shootings. You know them. I'll talk about them a little later too. Some of the greatest photos taken in the 20th century. I mean, certainly the most powerful. But visually, no, there's not a lot. I mean, there's very little film footage, just a few seconds, really. There's the photos, but there's never really been another visual narrative done of May 4. So this was a huge opportunity, I thought, which is one of the reasons I was so excited to take it on. There was one TV movie done in 1980, which is frankly not very good. That's it. So it was really wide open. And especially with comics, to be able to draw scenes like this one, that's right in our wheelhouse. So again, the next day, tensions drop. Now the campus is under military occupation. There are checkpoints everywhere, guardsmen everywhere. 1,200 guardsmen occupied the campus. And the students were not overjoyed to see them. And again, remember, it's 21,000 students, maybe 1,000 attacked the ROTC building. Really not even that many, more like 100 attacked the ROTC building, maybe 200, and the rest were just watching. But everybody's under the same restraints. Everybody's having guns pointed at them. Everybody's having, being demanded for IDs. Everybody's under curfew. Everybody's being bossed around. naturally they're kind of pissed off about that. It's, it's like, what the hell did I do? You know, um, it's perfectly understandable. So this is, one of the many, when I talk about incompetence, this is where it starts to come in. And this is also tied to politics because Rhodes was trying to make a big show of force to make up that ground in his primary election. So he was going to do it by cracking down on the students, whether they deserved it or not. Whether they were guilty or not was irrelevant as far as he was concerned and his voters. Uh, that night, there's a sit-in. The students on campus, about 600 of them, are frustrated. They march out onto the main street and sit down, violating curfew, and demand that the guard occupation end. And this is the moment where the whole thing kind of flips on its head. There's some really difficult drawing in this book. Really, it routinely kicked my ass during the entire time I was doing it. It took me 2 years to draw it. This page took like 4 days to draw. And it's just stuff I've never drawn before, a crowd scene like this. It's really hard to draw people very tiny. That's the hardest thing to draw because you don't want to put in too much information. You don't want to have too little. It's really a bitch. And I'm drawing night scenes, I'm drawing military scenes, I'm drawing crowd scenes, I'm drawing night military crowd scenes. It's just stuff I'd never tackled before. And I don't know that I could have done this book. In fact, I know I couldn't have done this book, when I did my first book, Punk Rock and Trailer Parks. There's no way, which was only 10 years ago. It's just, you have to acquire these skills. So anyways, this is the moment when the entire thing flips on its head because the guard had a chance here to lower tensions. They could have said, okay, we'll have a dialogue. We'll ease up on some stuff. We'll try to just go back to your dorms. We'll work it out tomorrow. Any of these things could have happened. Instead, they attacked. And does this sound familiar to anything we're seeing today? I mean, there was an article today I think in the New York Times, the Washington Post, I forget which, that said a lot of the violence at BLM protests were in fact caused by the police. The police attacking first, and then the protests get violent. Exact same thing here. And in Kent, this is known as the Night of the Helicopters because there were 3 helicopters that circled overhead and dropped tear gas on everyone they encountered outside, whether they were on campus or whether they were in the town. And a dozen people were bayoneted, some very seriously. People were beaten, lots of arrests. And at this moment, the whole thing flipped and it became, suddenly it was no longer an anti-war protest, it was an anti-guard protest. And it was students versus the guard. And the guard was tired, they were pissed off, they were tired of being ordered around by incompetent officers and yanked here and there. They'd been on duty for a couple of weeks, they wanted to go home. They were just pissed. And so it was really a very volatile situation. Again, some really great opportunities to draw, dark neighborhoods and spotlights, and it was kind of fun. The narrative you got to pace out. I mean, I'm fairly, for those of you who remember my comic strip, which ran for many years in the Chicago Reader. I was doing this kind of crazy post-punk garbage, really. I was very expressionistic. I was like pulling and stretching things all kinds of different ways and not following any rules. But when I started to do long form comics, I dialed all that back a lot. And I mean, obviously you have to have a more refined style. You have to have a lot more detail, a lot more clarity. But I think my books are actually laid out very traditionally. And you can see from this page here specifically, that just that kind of moment to moment transition, it's pretty textbook. I mean, I'm not really experimenting anymore. My view is that I had my fun back in the 90s, and I'm only interested in narrative clarity now. I mean, I want to tell the story. The story is paramount. So the style has to fit, those needs to service the story. That's what it's there for. Anyways. Oh, this is another splash page. This is the one that ends this chapter. And this is downtown Kent. They have these giant grain silos in downtown Kent. It's quite spectacular. They light them up. And that's the Cuyahoga River, actually, the famous burning river. And I came up with this scene when I was down in Kent. Kent's not far from Cleveland, maybe 40 minutes away. So I've spent a lot of time down there because I really believe in walking through a scene if you can, when you're making books and putting yourself in that space just to see what comes to you, what kind of inspiration comes to you. And I was walking down this stretch up there on the top there by the rail. Bill Schroeder's house is actually further down off in front of the scene here. And I was taking some reference photos there, and I'm walking down this stretch when this scene just popped into my head. I was like, oh man, that'd be really dramatic. That'd be cool. And that was just from being in that space. And I think this is one of my favorite pages in the book. So anyways. So now we come to May 4. And, by this time we've learned all about these kids. I have lots of scenes with how they're, moving through their day. This is Bill. He's late for class. He slept through his alarm. He's putting on his favorite outfit and bustling off to class. Here's Sandy, who her dog has chewed through its leash and run off again. And she's upset because she didn't have time to go look for him because she has to get to class because she has a test that day. So does Bill. This is part of the incredible set of circumstances here. The governor refused to close the university despite all the trouble that was happening. And Kent State was not even the most violent of the state universities. Ohio State was far worse. Ohio University was far worse. But he refused to close the university because that would be giving in to the radicals who wanted it closed. So these kids had no choice but to go to class because it was midterm week. And it was literally, in 1970, a matter of life or death because most of these students, the male students, had student deferments, which meant that excluded them from the draft. But to keep your student deferment, you had to keep up your grades. And if your grades fell too low, you were exposed to the draft. They had no choice but to be on campus this day. And yet the guardsmen were under orders. There's no student gatherings permitted. It's a campus of 21,000 kids. The whole campus is a student gathering. So there's no way that this was going to come out well. And so as noon approaches, there was a rally called for the Commons, which is the Central College Green. 400 kids are gathered around what was called the Victory Bell, chanting "Guard off campus." And all around them were students because at the noon class, I mean, if you've been on a big campus at noon, you know what it's like. Classes let out and every building just spews out thousands and thousands of students. And they were lining, there's this hill, the Commons was surrounded by a hill. It's almost like a bowl. And on the hill, there were just thousands of students standing there waiting to see what would happen. They all had books in their hands or were eating their lunch. And the general who was in charge this day assumed they were all protesters. And here's again that incompetence. The general was a guy named Canterbury, Brigadier General Canterbury, was a career desk jockey. And he assumed that the students were all violating his edict against public assembly. Assembly in a public university, by the way, which they had every right to do. It was a peaceful assembly. They were just chanting. So here again, we have this mixture of politics. Again, just ignoring the Constitution. Well, again, doesn't that sound familiar? And grandstanding. And this guy told his soldiers to lock and load, and they attacked. And that's when it all began. Now, May 4, it was all in broad daylight. So this is where we have the great photo record, as opposed to the previous 3 nights where there's almost no photo record. Because remember, we had a different relationship with photography back then. So again, this plays into my advantage as a visual storyteller, being able to create these images because they just don't exist, not many of them. The previous 3 days, most of the action took place at night. It was almost impossible to shoot at night, given the photo technology of the day, which was cameras, film. You had to, process things. You had to develop. You couldn't see what you were shooting until you developed it. You had to print it. It was a very slow, laborious process. It took a lot of skill. It wasn't like holding up a cell phone camera and just hitting the button. So there aren't a lot of images from those nights. Now, from May 4, there are a lot of images, and that's a different kind of challenge, which I'll talk about in a minute. Again, it's just kind of a very simple narrative at this point because I wanted to keep that clarity. And it's fast moving throughout all of this. I mean, the last chapter is the biggest chapter, but I think it reads the quickest. And of course is also the most powerful. The other nice thing about visual narrative is, as opposed to, say, the written word, is what happened this day is very confusing because the guard, this general, kind of directed them all over the place, and they were just stumbling around this campus back and forth and up and down. And if you don't understand, where things fit and how the path of the guard was, it's really hard to comprehend. But with visuals, I can really show it very clearly. And this bottom panel is actually more a news graphic than anything. And this is kind of the bullshit I did when I started out in my career. I worked for daily newspapers, and the only way they could justify hiring a political cartoonist is if I did other stuff too. So one of the things I did was these news graphics, because I was a journalism major in college, so I kind of knew how to do this stuff. And I never really liked doing it. I mean, I thought it was pretty boring, but damn if it doesn't work really well in this book. So you can really see very clearly what happens. And the other element that I was talking about earlier, there was political grandstanding and competence, and then there was a dose of malevolence. And this is what makes this story so hard to understand, and why the cover-up was so effective, because there were these 3 moving parts. And each one of these groups kind of hid behind the other and pointed at the other, pointed the finger of blame at the other. And they were able to completely fog up what happened. But the malevolence came from a small group of guardsmen. It was called G Troop, part of the 107th Armored Cavalry. There was only 16 of them. But these were guardsmen who were described to me as really hard-ass assholes. They were older. A lot of them were in law enforcement, so they were kind of no-nonsense, gung-ho law and order types. They were just really pissed off. They didn't like students. They didn't like student radicals especially, and they wanted to kind of take it to them, and were very enthusiastic about that. But it didn't really work out very well because the students were defying them, and they weren't getting the result they wanted. So at some point, at one crucial point, these guys very likely, we don't know for sure because none of them have ever talked, but all the other explanations have kind of faded away. They very likely put their heads together and said, okay, wait for the order. Pick out your targets, wait for the order, we're gonna let these fuckers have it. And when they marched to a certain point on top of a hill, an order rang out. G Troop turned in unison and opened fire. And what comes next is, it was only 13 seconds. 67 bullets fired in 13 seconds. It was a salvo. They were firing down a hill. There was a group of maybe 50 protesters at the bottom of the hill, about 250 feet away, that they were targeting. Unfortunately, there was also a parking lot and a major artery called Midway Drive behind them that was packed with students, 600 or 700 students. And these bastards fired right into the middle of them. 4 dead, 9 shot and wounded, 4 of them critically, 2 of them crippled for life. Let's talk a little bit about research because this really was pretty intensive. I spent 2 years researching this book, just researching, before I even started writing. And like I said earlier, I was a journalism major, so I know how to do this stuff, and it's always been kind of fun for me because it's how I learned to tell stories. So it's very natural for me, and I think it works out really well in a story like this. I started with interviews, as I said, getting close to anyone who I could talk to, anyone who was there, and I was always amazed how many people in my life I had met who were there that day, who were students. Now, Kent State is a huge arts hub. So a lot of people in the arts community, went there, they taught there. So there was that connection. A lot of people in the music business, we talked earlier about Devo, but there were a lot of other bands who I've known over the years who were also there. For example, Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders was there. Joe Walsh was there. All these guys were there that day. A lot of people in media. I worked in newspapers, so I would run into older veterans who had covered the event or had been there in journalism school. Kent State had a really good journalism school. And there are even some people in the comics community. There was a guy who worked for Dark Horse for years who was there. He was a student. And much to my surprise, he just like volunteered that information one day when I was talking to him at Comic-Con. I'm like, holy shit. And I eventually coaxed his story out of him. He had never really told his story before. And it's a great story. So, it was just these personal connections. And then you make one personal connection and that leads to another. Because they say, oh, well, you had to talk to so-and-so. Here, I'll give you I'll ask him if he'll talk to you, And it just kept spreading and spreading and spreading. I spent a lot of time in the archives. Kent State, the main library here, at the top floor has something called the May 4 collection, which is this vast treasure trove of material from the shootings and everything that happened. I mean, there were police reports and oral histories, over like 200 of them, written accounts, news report, you name it, photos. It's an amazing archive. There's a second archive at Yale called the Kent State Collection, which was generated by the civil trials in the 70s because the parents of the slain students sued the state of Ohio. And all this material they got in discovery and deposition, they sent to Yale. So between these two archives, it was just a mountain of material. Now, I spent as much time doing visual research as I did doing any other kind of research because, of course, this is a visual medium. And the challenge was, one, I'm an outsider. I mean, it's not my generation. I came of age a generation later. I didn't go to Kent State. I went to Ohio State. I never lived in Kent. I've spent time in Kent, but I've never lived there. So I didn't have that kind of intimate knowledge that comes from, living and going to a college. I mean, I could sit down right now and draw you Ohio State in 1982 and probably get 90% of it right, just from my personal connection to it. But Kent State was completely alien to me. And, colleges and college towns, they change so much over time, month to month, let alone over 50 years. So it was a real challenge. It was kind of a visual minefield, but campus maps were a huge boon. This is from 1970. I used street guides. I used phone directories. I had a photo archivist in Kent who was a huge help to me. I talked to locals about, well, what was here on this strip? What stores were here? And it was like putting together a puzzle. For example, this is the Water Street Bar District from that first night when the riot that set it all off. So it's just this little colorful bar district of maybe, 15 bars. But I spent a couple months putting together this one panel because so much of it has changed. A lot of these buildings are gone. All of the signs are gone. Most of the buildings have been repurposed or are empty. And there's not a lot of photo reference because, again, getting back to that, lack of photos from this era, especially here. It's just a bar district, you know, it's this bar district in Kent, Ohio, and who cares? No one was taking photos of this thing. So it was a real challenge. I had the street directories. I knew where things were. I used that to like assemble this piece you see here is almost a puzzle, you know, and I filled in the addresses, and I actually went down to Water Street and stood there so I could see what address was directly across from each other, so I could fill in the existing buildings, and then I filled in the buildings that were missing. Oh, it took forever. But I didn't have any idea of what it looked like. Some of the buildings were there, okay, but I didn't have an exact representation. I'm kind of proud of the way that whoa, what's going on there? That was wild. Of how I solved it. Here we go. This is a documentary from 1971 about the shootings, a TV documentary. Good documentary, actually. I just stumbled across it looking for stuff. And the narrator here is talking about the Water Street riot, and there it is. There's Water Street in 1971, so it's just 1 year later. And it's perfect. And suddenly I have all those signs, and even though it's fuzzy and out of focus, it would be good for nothing. You know, it was good enough for me, and I could fill this shit in. And so that was like a little victory dance around the studio when I found this thing. And then once in a while, you find these little crazy nuggets of gold. I found a bunch of phone messages in the May 4 archive to Sandy. And phone messages were the texts of the day. They didn't have texting back then, obviously, but kids were still, you know, they're still communicating. They're still calling each other. And the way they left messages is they would literally leave messages. And in this case, it was to the speech center where Sandy worked, and there'd be a student volunteer manning the phone. And people would call in, say, hey, I want to leave a message to Sandy, and they'd pull out a form, fill out the message, and then tack it to a message board. That's literally what that means. That was the message board. You tacked it up there with a thumb tack. And when students came in or they left the speech center, they'd look at the message board and see if there were any messages for them. And so this was a message to Sandy. It was from a guy named Steve Drucker, who was her freshman year boyfriend. He was also Jeff Miller's roommate during 1970. They shared a house together. So he's a really great interview, a key interview. It's just a sweet little message. Hi, about supper at 5, I'll call you. So I took a photo of it because I didn't know if Drucker had it, and indeed he didn't, and I sent it to him. But then I noticed the name, Miss Beach. Her last name's Scheuer. Sandy Beach? What the fuck? So I asked Drucker, what's up with this name? And he said, oh yeah, that was my pet name for her, Sandy Beach, because that's what she was. She was a sun-splashed sandy beach. And I called her that all the time, and then her friends and her classmates started calling her that as well. I'm like, oh man, that's great. And nobody else had that. And I worked that into the narrative, you know, just as like a little sprinkle of gold dust. And if you do enough of that, you know, it adds a real depth to the narrative because it just gets you a little closer to these people. And then I kind of went down the rabbit hole with this, but I spent a lot of time with the radical politics of the era. And you Chicagoans will appreciate this because a lot of this is based in Chicago and specifically surrounding the Weathermen. The Weathermen were the Antifa of 1970. The difference being the Weathermen were actually a real organization where Antifa is just, you know, a figment of Fox News's imagination. But the Weathermen were the extreme radical fringe of SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, which was the largest student protest group in the country with over 100,000 members. And somehow the Weathermen, who were extreme communist revolutionaries who wanted to actually overthrow the US government, believe it or not, took over SDS in what can be described as a parliamentary coup in summer of 1969, and within 6 months had reduced it to a smoldering ruin. But the fear of the Weathermen drove the authorities to extremes. And you know about something called COINTELPRO, which was the FBI's infamous subversive campaign against everyone to the left of mainstream Democrats. It involves sweeping unconstitutional activities, illegal wiretaps, break-ins, beating people up, hanging people out of windows, all kinds of stuff. The CIA had a similar program, which we still don't know fully about because it's still classified. It was all driven by the fear of these extreme communist revolutionaries. And the Weathermen had a big presence in Kent and Ohio. Ohio was a stronghold, as was Illinois. Illinois, Michigan, Ohio were the three strongholds of this particular faction. And one of the guys was this guy named Terry Robbins, who's a particularly fascinating character. He was based in Michigan for a while, also in Chicago. And he was one of the founders of the Kent SDS, which was very small, but very active. It was maybe 200 members in Kent, very active. And the authorities completely freaked out. And so much of what happened at Kent State was driven by this just frantic paranoia on the part of law enforcement and the authorities, coming down from the Nixon administration and the Justice Department and the intelligence services, all the way down to local law enforcement. And it was just like this fever pitch, and they believed there were weathermen behind every bush. They thought they were on the rooftop with guns. They were just going crazy out of fear of these guys, who of course were nowhere to be seen. But in a way, it's almost understandable because, for example, this guy, Terry Robbins, this is how he wound up. In March 1970, in New York City, in a safe house in the Village, Terry Robbins was making bombs in the basement of this building. And one of them went off and the whole building blew up. They had like 10 cases of dynamite in the basement. And they were planning to set these off at a non-commissioned officers dance at Fort Dix. And after this happened, the FBI and the CIA and Nixon went into a total panic. And they had to find these guys, and they were looking for them everywhere. And so that's why the paranoia was so high leading up to Kent State. And it all got directed at what was happening at Kent State, even though it had really nothing to do at that point with the Weathermen. But it's really fascinating history. Hasn't really been told very well. I kind of regret almost not doing a book about the Weathermen, honestly. It was really interesting stuff. And so you have to find it in pieces and parts over many, many years. But it's really interesting stuff. And here in Cleveland, just before the events at Kent State, somebody blew up our thinker. This is in front of the Art Museum, and it's an actual thinker. It was cast by Auguste Rodin himself. Somebody put a bomb, dynamite, under the base, blew the poor bugger right off the base, irreparably damaging his feet and his legs, and scrawled, kill the ruling class on the pedestal. Now, if it wasn't a weatherman, it was somebody inspired by the weathermen. So when this happened, I mean, everybody in Ohio was talking. Right? They assumed that the rumors in Kent among the Guard were that busloads of weathermen guerrillas, combat trained in Cuba, were coming from Detroit and Chicago to attack the Guard on Kent State. So they just saw weathermen behind every bush. It's really interesting stuff. Let's talk a little bit about a process, because that's really comics wonky, and that's a fun way to end this. I started with a script. I don't always. I did with My Friend Dahmer, and I did with this. So the two nonfiction books, or nonfiction-ish books, I had a script. It's just kind of a way for me to organize my thoughts, maybe, and see how to block out the story. It's a first step. The actual writing isn't with thumbnails. So, I just do these thumbnails, and it comes very quickly. I like to be really fast, and I don't spend a lot of time like doing, Scott McCloud theory or anything like that. It's all very instinctual. It's just from a lifetime of making comics and reading comics. So I know how I want to tell the story, which I talked about a little earlier. I'm pretty traditional at this point, but I want to be clear. I don't want it to be dull. I mean, I'm moving the camera around a lot, so to try to get some visual interest. And from there, I go to right to a tight pencil. And this is the most time-consuming part of the process, because this is where I pour in all my visual research. So I've got, the bottom panel, for example, is Sandy walking down her street. That's actually her street. And they put in period cars, you work in period clothes, you do all that other stuff. So this takes a long time. But you can see from the thumbnail, that's pretty damn close. I mean, I changed a couple of the angles, but the story is there. The storytelling's there. And from the pencil, then I ink. And I ink on a light tablet using a fresh piece of paper. So there's no erasing, which took me a god-awful long time to figure that out. But man, now that I've done it, I'd never go back. And then I scan it all into the computer. I mean, up till now, it's all done by hand. And it's not because I'm a Luddite or a dinosaur, even though maybe I am. It's just that I like drawing by hand. I mean, I just like scraping a pen and a brush over a piece of paper. It's what gives me pleasure. So, there are no rules in comics. It's whatever you want to do and however you enjoy yourself. And this is how I enjoy myself. But once it's inked, I scan it in and then I add the finishes. So it's, a 4-step process: thumbnail, pencil, ink, finish. Now, of course, you have to think in terms of a 2-page spread, right? Because the first thing you see when you open a book, that first visual statement, is going to be those 2 pages staring you in the face before you start reading. So you always have to think about how they go together. And this is the thumbnail for 2 pages later in the book. There's the pencil. Now, I know it's going to be a really dramatic scene. I know it's a night scene. It's got fire. It's going to be really fun to draw with the shadows and the glare. But I don't have to put everything in. I mean, I'm already thinking ahead. I'm making some notations. You see the little X marks in places where I know I'm going to fill things in. And then comes the inks. So, thumbnail, pencil, inks. Again, it's pretty clear. I mean, I don't really vary from what I come up with at the beginning. Now, not every page goes this easy. I mean, there were some pages, believe me, I had to do like 3 or 4 times, or patch together with, like 6 different pieces of paper. I mean, we all have those. But this is how a book comes together, so it's 250 thumbnails, 250 pencils, 250 inks, 250 finishes. It took 2 years to draw, and really I could have used another year to do this book. Really, honestly, I wish I had it, but I had that deadline because I wanted it to come out before the 50th anniversary, which of course went up in a puff of smoke. But I could have used that extra 6 months too, which is how often it was delayed. That would have been awesome, but oh well. Now there were some challenges. Now you all know this photo. It's one of the most famous photos of the 20th century. Easy. It's taken by a guy named John Philo, who won a Pulitzer Prize for taking it. He was a student photographer. All of the really amazing photos from May 4, and there's a lot, were taken by student photographers, which I find really inspiring because I was a student photographer myself. And, these guys were literally throwing themselves in front of bullets. Their courage was incredible, or naivete, or both. But so you have this really famous photo, and I figure, how am I gonna tell this? How am I gonna depict this? Because I was thinking back to that TV movie from 1980, and they replicated this. And the way they did it was that they matched the photo perfectly with like live actors, and they froze it for a second, and then moved on, and it looked really stiff and staged and really lame. And that stuck with me. And I saw this thing years ago. I mean, it wasn't anything I have seen recently. And so that had always stuck with me. And when I was approaching this, it's like, I can't do that. I can't, first of all, I can't top this photo. Unlike other places where graphic narrative can add something to telling of the story, I can't with this. but I have to include it because it's such a pivotal moment. So what I did was, this is a 3-page spread. Hope you can see it all. I decided not to focus on the figure. Marianne Vecchio was a teenage runaway, screaming over the body of Jeff Miller and that ghastly river of blood coming out of his head. Instead, I decided to focus on something uniquely comics, and that's the screen, lettering the screen, and that sound effect that we can do in comics visually. That's something that you can't do in photography. That's something you can't do in film. Obviously, you don't have to in film. I mean, Philo's photo, you can literally hear the scream just by looking at the photo. But this is something enhanced, and it also it becomes actually the action across these 3 pages. And so that's the way I decided to focus on this particular scene. It took a while to work out. I mean, this is the thumbnail, and you can see it's not really anything worthwhile at all. But when I started doing the pencil, I started playing with it and moving it around. So, this is an example of me working it out at the pencil stage to the point where I was satisfied with it. Oops. And then you have the finish. And I think it's pretty effective. I mean, it's as effective as I could make it, I mean, this is obviously, again, I'm never going to top that photo. I don't even really try. But I think I include what I thought was important, and that was that scream of horror and what happened in that parking lot. So, like I said, this story has become more and more relevant as the summer has passed, and I just kind of been watching it, stuck in my studio with this book sitting in warehouses, watching this summer unfold in a state of ice cold horror. I think we are just so close to another Kent State. We are so close to it. And so this book, I hope, serves as a bit of a warning. If you're going to threaten the people in power, truly threaten them, their response can be absolutely lethal. That's not to say we shouldn't threaten them. I think we should. But that's good information to have. Because the kids at Kent State, they didn't even think they were in danger. Most of them thought the guardsmen were carrying blanks. Even when they were shooting those guns and the bullets were pinging off the pavement around them, some of the students were yelling out, "Don't worry, they're only blanks." So, we can't have that naivete in 2020. So that's what this book is about. And that's my spiel.
Thank you so much. That was really good. I'm applauding on behalf of everyone.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
If you had those extra 6 months to work on this, would you have done anything different with it, do you think?
Well, yeah, I probably would have added some color. I just didn't have time. I mean, I would have had to hire some help, but I would have liked to have done it in color. But it just, that deadline was killing me, so I couldn't do it. I don't think it would have added a whole lot, but it would have been nice to do.
Yeah. I see that we did have a question. And if anybody has
one question,
feel free to post them in the chat. Joe asks, when did you become aware of Jackson? It's Jackson/State.
Jackson State. I've known about Jackson State for years. Jackson State was a black college in the South, and law enforcement similarly opened fire on a dorm at Jackson State after a day of protests and killed 2 kids a few weeks after Kent State. So they kind of happened back to back. There's also one called the Orangeburg Massacre, which almost nobody knows about. That took place in South Carolina State, which was another black college. The authorities in South Carolina almost completely covered it up, and that was even worse. That happened in '68, I believe. So yeah, these things are all, they're all linked, but I focused on Kent State. I mean, I just, it's already a 250-page book. If I included Jackson State, it would have been a 400-page book. So.
Oh, and Geneva says, or Geneva, if you want to unmute yourself and
Yeah, you can
say,
actually talk. Are you aware of the?
here, Geneva, do you want me to, here, I'll unmute you and you can, if you want to talk, go
Oh
for it.
yeah, I was just gonna say, thank you for doing this talk. I read My Friend Dahmer and really enjoyed, uh, you know, everything about it and just kind of the way you tell a story. And so I
Oh,
was
thank
really
you.
looking forward to kind of learning more about, this book and the
Hmm.
process behind it. And I really do appreciate the level of detail. Like you could have just made up a bunch of storefronts and probably 99% of people wouldn't have known, but
I
like
know that's my sad
no,
state
no.
of.
I think that's really great, and like knowing that will make me appreciate it that much more.
Oh,
Just
thank you,
because,
thank you.
that's some great context to have. So thank you for going through all that and kind of uh, relating your experiences growing up around that to what you're seeing today.
Hmm.
Since I'm only 28, I don't have
Right,
that scope of experience, and so I was
right, and it's not
glad to hear
important.
yours.
It's not important that you do because it's just a great story in and of itself. So, I mean, you'll process it differently than somebody who is more familiar with the story, and that's okay. I kind of actually regret that they subtitled it "Four Dead in Ohio." That was the publisher's decision, and I thought, man, you're giving away the ending because anyone, I mean, most millennials probably don't. I mean, they might not even know that there were kids killed. So, I kind of wondered about that. I mean, I don't think it really matters that much, but it's just a great story that I think once you get caught up in it, whether you know anything about it or not, you'll get carried away by it.
I will speak.
Go ahead.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I was being heard. I was a college graduate after this happened.
Hmm.
So a couple of things. I think I've asked you this before. Were you aware of the crankshaft storyline that
Yeah,
made?
I've seen it. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Uh,
Yeah, the artist Chuck Ayers
yeah.
he was there that day. I know Chuck. Um, he was there that day, so he's done his own version of it. Yeah, yeah.
But the other thing is, I've heard you mention that this was going to be happening in San Diego. I don't know, maybe 3 years ago,
Mm.
and I've been really waiting for it. I felt your disappointment at
Oh,
loving it.
thanks, thanks.
I've been teaching this unit on Kent State.
Have you?
Oh yeah, since maybe 1973
Wow,
or four. So
wow.
I've had to gather my own resources. I'm a retired social studies history teacher.
Uh-huh.
I regret not being teaching now to have this as a resource.
Oh, thanks.
I mean, there's some
Yeah,
great stuff coming out now.
yeah, there is. There's
The,
been
con-
some
the
recent.
Constitution Illustrated from Skoriak, in this book, it's kind of like, come on, guys, give me 15 more years. I want to thank you for your efforts. This is just really supreme.
Oh, thank you. Coming
I
from
mean,
you, that's great.
you bet. Compliments for sure.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
So, same thing. Thank you so much for doing this. Huge fan of yours going back to the city, especially.
Oh, thanks. That's good to hear.
Your books are amazing. I had a comment and then a question. The comment was, it was really cool to hear you talk about how you recreated Water Street, because when I read that, that was one of the most interesting parts of the book to me. The detail in it, it was, to me as a comic nerd, it was reminiscent of Spain, how he draws buffalo. Those
Oh,
scenes.
thanks,
I'm
thanks.
shocked that you didn't go to Kent State. You hadn't
Yeah.
been on. That was really cool.
Oh, thanks.
A lot of care going into it. My question is this: when you've spent these years doing all these interviews and talking to folks, were any of the folks hostile to your inquiries, or did you have any issues?
Not so much hostile. Reticent. There were some people who didn't want to talk. I mean,
Mm.
and you have to respect that. Um, there are some people who gave their accounts earlier in various forms, so it wasn't really necessary that they talk because those accounts are already there and they exist, and I track those down. But it would be nice. What I would often do in that case is sometimes I would press it a little bit just to ask for specific details. It's like, well, where were you exactly at this moment? What was happening here? If they were with Jeff or, with one of the other four, for example. And I could sometimes coax stuff out of them like that. So it was a real mixed bag. A lot of people were crying by the end of the interviews. I mean, you can really see how this thing still lives with them. And I mean, it's literally like the song lyric, what would you do if you saw her dead on the ground? These people saw her dead on the ground, and they were 19 and 20 years old. And that has never left them. Like I said, I wanted to recreate that feeling. I wanted this story to be felt in the way that they felt it. And, this book packs a wallop at the end. And the way that I end it, I mean, it ends very shortly after the shooting, because that's really what I wanted to leave the reader with. And the story goes on for years, because there was this vast cover-up and these lawsuits and all of these developments, and it's really a story in itself. But I just left that. I just wanted it to end right here, because I wanted that to be like the lingering thought of those kids getting cut down. And again, to make it felt. And that was definitely came from talking to the people who were there. Yeah, definitely.
Excellent.
What were you saying about Water Street? Yeah, Water Street. Oh, thank you for the Spain reference. Spain's a huge influence of mine.
Sure.
And a lot of people who don't know comics that well, they always say, well, he draws kind of like Robert Crumb. And I'm like, what? Robert Crumb? I haven't even read that many Robert Crumb comics in my life. I mean, it's always been Spain for me. So I appreciate that. And I always get that with comics talks. People recognize the roots. So that's awesome. Water Street. Yeah, Water Street was fun to recreate. I spent a lot of time there because it was in the 80s, because there were a lot of punk clubs on Water Street. And I used to go there when I was a garbage man, actually, which is the subject of my book, Trashed. When I was a garbage man, I would go to Ken a lot to hear punk shows. I'd hear the Dead Boys or Devo at one of the punk clubs. So I did have some experience there, but that was a lot of fun to recreate. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks.
Sure.
One more question.
Sure.
I think you mentioned maybe on Facebook this FBI wannabe guy with the 45.
Oh, Terry Norman. Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, he was a student. He was a gung-ho reactionary student. Kent State had a huge law enforcement school. And there were probably more right-wing reactionaries on Kent State campus in 1970 than left-wing. That's always frequently left out. The left-wing reactionaries, or not reactionaries, the left-wing radicals made more of a stink. And obviously they were caught up in the politics of the day, but there were more right-wingers on campus than left. And Terry was one of those, and he was working for the campus police as an informant. He was working for the FBI. He had a long history of working for them. He wanted to be an FBI agent. And he actually had some as yet undetermined ties to the CIA as well, all from a 22-year-old kid. But, they wanted people who would blend in with campus communities. And they picked Terry, who did not blend in, because everyone on campus knew he was a rat. So he was spotted immediately. He was always thrown out of SDS meetings. He was kind of confrontational, a little bit immature maybe. And he kind of blundered into the middle of this protest. And he was armed. He was carrying a gun that day. And there was for many years a narrative coming out of the Guard that Norman had set off the shootings by firing his gun into the air. And that was countered by many eyewitnesses who said, no, he didn't fire his gun. But the Guard kept pushing that as a way to cover their own tracks, covering the tracks that they had cooked up the plan, premeditated, to open fire when a signal came, purely on their own. So it's been this long ongoing thing, but he's a fascinating character, yeah, and he's in the book. He's a secondary character, yeah.
Scott Cedarland, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or?
Yeah, I can. As you were doing the research for the book, was there anything that really surprised you, or that really jumped out at you that you didn't know?
Gosh, is there anything that surprised me? Well, there was one thing, but I don't want to give it away for people who haven't read the book, that I kind of really confirmed more than anyone else. Some of the interpersonal relationships that the students had with each other. Yeah, no, there wasn't much. I mean, I've been familiar with this story for a long time, so I've always followed it over the years. And like I said, I knew a lot of people who were there, so I've heard stories. So yeah, it's always been kind of a hobby of mine, Kent State, if that's the right word to use. So not too many surprises. I think the reader will find a lot of surprises because, as I said at the beginning, there's a certain kind of just casual understanding of what Kent State was, and that is in fact not what the reality is. So, I mean, it is a story full of surprises, but nothing that really tremendously surprised me, no.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Tony here. Thanks again for coming, Derf.
Sure, my pleasure.
The question I had for you, just some insight into how you pick your long form projects, because kind of you said before, there's such a very long research cycle and then literally years of drawing.
Yeah.
Do they start as like kernels you've been carrying with you forever? Is it something you weigh versus one another, or is there like a personal connection through line, which you kind of see with Dahmer Trashed and now Kent State?
Well, I get away from that a bit with Kent State because my personal connection is very slim, not like the other three.
No.
When I was very much a part of my experience. So I don't want to limit myself just to memoir or basing on personal experience. Yeah, all the books I've done so far have been stories that I've carried with me a long time. So, it's just a matter of when to get to them. That was, it's been a big adjustment moving from comic strips. I did a weekly comic strip for 20 years to books, going from that weekly output, or, I usually did more than one a week. I would do like 3 or 4 various cartoons a week, to doing a book every 4 years. Yeah, that's like a big adjustment. But I feel I've been fairly productive. I mean, 4 books in 10 years is not bad, considering that they're pretty involved books. So yeah, it's just, this is just the way it is. I mean, I wish I was faster. I wish I was like Noah Van Sciver, somebody spitting stuff out like every month. But we are what we are, and I have this kind of detail obsessive style that just kind of slows me down. But I'm happy with my output. But moving forward, I have I'm trying to figure out what to do next, and I haven't really landed on anything yet. I will, but it just hasn't come yet. This has been a tough year to write and conceptualize, just because it's just, God, fuck. You just want to go to sleep until like 2022, don't you? I mean, it's just, yeah. So I'll figure something out eventually, but yeah. So far, these have all been books that I've had on a list, and I have some others. I don't know whether I'll get to them or not, or I'll come up with something new. But work till you die.
What's on that list?
I'm not telling you. Fun stuff. That's what's on that list.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Derf? Joe says, I would like to see the story of the shooter in Wisconsin told.
Oh, yeah.
Are you taking requests?
Oh, the book of the kid? Yeah, that'd be a great one, wouldn't it? But yeah, I mean, you have certain libel concerns when you take on something like that. I mean, he's backed by some pretty big money now, I mean, you don't want to take on the entire right-wingosphere and all those billionaire billionaire backers. That'd be brutal. Maybe I could fictionalize it. Yeah, I've actually kind of thought about, I mean, obviously a lot of people are thinking about doing something about the events of this summer, but you have to wait for the smoke to clear, you really do. So we'll see what happens.
Well, thank you everybody so much for coming. I'm going to post back into the chat like all the stuff that I put up earlier in case you want it, book links, Derf's social media, our social media, all that stuff. Derf is, O'Brien says, thank you for showing your process.
Thank
you for
my
coming
pleasure.
Is there anything else that you want to say? Do you have any stuff coming up? Like, what's your next like event that you're doing, or whatever? If there's anything you want to plug, I mean, the book.
No, not really. I'm doing the Brooklyn Book Fest. I'm on a panel there. CXC. I'm a total Zoom slut at this point. I'll do whatever anybody asks me. I was like, sure. What else have I got to do? I'm actually doing a talk with virtual talk. Well, actually, it'll be live there in an empty auditorium at the Akron Main Library, which is going to be pretty hairy because that's going to be all the Kent State people. So that's going to be intense.
Are they going to have all the Kent State people sitting 6 feet away from each other with like a?
No, there'll be nobody in there. They'll be watching. They'll be watching virtually.
Oh, got it.
But I also did. This is the place where I did my opening event for my friend Dahmer. And it was all these people who knew Dahmer, like, all my friends from high school and teachers, and the cop who let him off the hook in the book. He showed up, and yeah, it was really surreal. So I expect that this talk's going to be probably just as strange. But none of you have to come. It's just it's just what I'm doing this week.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to leave this going for like 1 more minute. If everybody wants to, if you want to unmute yourselves and clap, no pressure, but that makes it seem like sort of a normal experience.
Clap for Quimby's. Clap for Quimby's.
Clap. 2 fast clap.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
Thanks, guys.
All right, I'm gonna end the meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
Liz.
you so much.
Thanks
Take
for
care.
having me. Bye.
Bye. Oh yeah, and you can get the book at quimbys.com.